At dawn on May 29, 1453, Mehmed II's final assault broke against the Theodosian walls, and the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople failed. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who in our history was struck down at the Kerkoporta breach and carried bleeding from the line, instead held his footing. His Genoese and Greek defenders kept the inner wall. The small postern gate stayed shut behind them, and the Janissaries who had poured toward the gap found no gap to exploit. The third wave recoiled. By the time the sun was fully up, the assault that should have ended an empire had spent itself against stone and discipline. For 53 days the city had endured. Mehmed, only 21 years old, had broken a truce to begin the siege on April 6th, and the Hungarian gunpowder Orbán's great bombard had hammered the triple land fortifications until whole sections crumbled. Roughly 7,000 to 8,000 defenders, 2,000 of them foreign troops, had stood against an Ottoman host of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000. The arithmetic had only ever pointed one way, and yet on this morning the arithmetic failed, because a single man did not fall and a single line did not break. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. By late May, the besiegers were already strained. Gunpowder ran short, supplies thinned, and morale soured among commanders who had expected a quicker triumph. When the dawn attack collapsed, that quiet discontent found its voice. Within days, Mehmed struck camp. He withdrew toward Edirne with his army intact but his prize denied. But what failed at the walls that morning would echo for centuries, and the consequences would reach far beyond the city the Sultan could not take. The Grand Vizier Shandali Halil Pasha had warned against this. He had opposed the siege from the start, favored accommodation with the Greeks, and counseled patience over the gamble at the walls. In our history, Mehmed's triumph silenced such men and cost Halil his life within weeks of victory. Here, the failure vindicated him. Halil kept his head, and with it his influence, and the accommodationist faction at the Ottoman court suddenly had the stronger argument. Mehmed was not broken by the setback, but he was chastened. A young sultan who had wagered his prestige on the city's fall now had to govern men who had watched that wager lose. To attack the walls again so soon, with strained supplies and stiffened critics, was to risk far more than a second repulse, so he turned his armies away from the Theodosian walls towards softer ground. The Balkans and Anatolia offered conquests that did not require shattering the strongest fortifications in the Christian world. This was not retreat, it was redirection. Ottoman power remained vast, and the empire's European capital at Edirne still anchored a war machine that no single defeat could undo. But the failure rearranged the court's center of gravity. Caution had been proven right once, and at a court that remembered, being right once bought time. The Sultan would expand, but he would expand around the city, not through it. Constantine Ilymph of Palaiologos had survived the assault that in our history killed him in the streets of his own capital. Survival, though, was not strength. Byzantium by 1453 had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a handful of outposts, dependent on Italian credit and imported grain, its hinterland long gone. The emperor had kept his throne, but he ruled a bulwark that could not feed or arm itself. So he sold what he had. The one asset Constantinople now possessed was the fact of its survival, proof that the walls could hold, that Western money spent here was not money thrown into a tomb. Constantine traded that symbolic survival for hard Western terms. He accepted Venetian garrisons and Venetian credit. He made the contested Church Union of Florence, backed by Pope Nicholas V in 1439 and resented by his own clergy, into a working arrangement rather than a dead letter. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate, turned the city's endurance into leverage, arguing in the courts of the Latin West that a Constantinople that fought and won was worth defending. In exchange came grain, money, and gunpowder. The Republic of Venice, ever the rival of Genoa, saw the chance to monetize a surviving Byzantine frontier and took it. None of this restored the empire's greatness. It mortgaged what remained, but mortgages buy time, and time was the only thing Constantine truly needed. Orbán's guns had taught a lesson written in rubble. The Theodosian walls had guarded the city for 1,000 years against rams and ladders, but they had been built for an age before the Great Bombard, and the bombardment had nearly proven it. The defenders who survived understood exactly what had almost killed them. With Italian money in the treasury, Byzantine engineers set about rebuilding for the artillery age. The high, thin curtains that shattered under cannon fire gave way, section by section, to lower and thicker works, bastions angled to catch attackers in crossfire, earthworks heaped to swallow shot rather than crack under it. This was slow, expensive, unglamorous labor, paid for in Venetian gold and justified by the memory of April's broken stone. The city would not survive a second siege on the strength of its old walls. It might survive on the strength of new ones. The fortress of Rumeli Hisari, raised on the Bosporus in 1452 to throttle the city, still loomed as a reminder that Ottoman strength had not vanished. The boom chain that had sealed the Golden Horn, bypassed once when Mehmed hauled his warships overland on greased rollers, was no longer enough by itself. Survival now meant adapting to the very weapons that had nearly ended the city. The walls that held in 1453 would not be the walls that held in the decades after. They would be remade in Gunpowder's image. In our history, the fall of Constantinople scattered its scholars westward, and Greek learning arrived in Italy carried by refugees fleeing a conquered city, helping to feed the Renaissance. Here, the libraries did not burn. The exodus that enriched Florence and Rome thinned to a trickle, because the men who would have fled had a city to stay in. That changed how Greek learning reached the West, not as a flood of refugees, but as a trade. Constantinople, desperate for revenue and rich in manuscripts, sold its inheritance abroad. Copyists multiplied texts for Italian buyers. Tutors crossed the sea on contract. A steady commerce in manuscripts moved Plato and Aristotle, the mathematicians and the church fathers, into Western hands for a price, rather than as the salvage of catastrophe. The effect was slower and more deliberate than the sudden transfusion of our timeline. But it was not smaller. A living city of scholars could keep producing, correcting, and explaining what it sold, where a scattered diaspora could only carry what it had grabbed. The learning still flowed west. It simply flowed through ledgers instead of through loss, and the Greek East remained, for a while longer, a place where that learning was made rather than merely mourned. Ottoman power did not retreat after 1453. It grew around the surviving city rather than over it. Denied Constantinople, Mehmed and his successors pressed where the walls were softer. The Balkans came under Ottoman rule. The Levant followed. The empire's reach expanded across the lands that had always been its natural field of conquest, and Aedirn remained the hub of a state that no single failure had weakened. What endured at the center of it all was a paradox, a Christian capital surrounded by an Islamic empire that could not, or would not, pay the price to take it. Byzantium survived as a guarded enclave, a remnant hemmed in on every side, its fields and frontiers gone, but its harbor still busy. The Sultans tolerated it for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy. The city's port generated customs revenue. Its trade enriched the surrounding provinces. A contained Constantinople, taxed and watched, was worth more intact than in ashes, at least for now. This was survival without restoration. The empire that held the walls did not reverse its long decline. It merely arrested its final collapse. It remained dependent, surrounded, and small. But it remained. And along the line where Christian city met Ottoman Empire, a long frontier settled into place, tense, profitable, and permanent enough that both sides learned to live along its edge. The Eastern Mediterranean now held a balance no one had planned. Three powers shared its waters. An Ottoman Empire, vast and expanding, yet denied its natural capital, controlled the surrounding land. A Byzantine remnant, tied by debt and treaty to the west, held the city and its harbor. And between them sailed Venice, the maritime republic that had wagered on the survivors and grown rich on the wager. Venice understood frontiers as opportunities. Every contested border was a market, and the line between Ottoman land and Byzantine city was the most valuable border of all. Venetian credit had helped hold Constantinople. Venetian ships now carried the trade that flowed across the divide. The old rivalry with Genoa, whose colony at Pera had stayed officially neutral through the siege, sharpened into a contest for the profits of the frontier. The republic that monetized the surviving bulwark over its Genoese rivals reaped the reward. For the Ottomans, the arrangement was an irritation they had learned to profit from. A trading city in their midst, however Christian, fed customs revenue into their treasury and goods into their markets. For Byzantium, dependence was the price of breath. None of the three powers loved the balance. All three exploited it. And the sea that might have become an Ottoman lake instead remained a contested water, divided among an empire denied its prize, a remnant clinging to its walls, and a republic counting its coin. In the end, the empire that held the walls mattered less as a state than as a symbol. Worn by tribute, hollowed by dependence, hemmed by a shrinking hinterland that produced nothing it needed, Byzantium endured without ever again becoming strong. George Francis, the imperial official and chronicler, managed the diplomacy and kept the record of a reign that survived by negotiation rather than by arms. What he recorded was endurance, not triumph. Yet endurance was its own kind of power. As long as Constantinople stood, Christian and unconquered, Europe's mental map of its own eastern edge stayed open. The city that should have fallen became, instead, a fixed point, an idea more durable than the fragile state that housed it. The Latin West, slow and grudging in its aid, found in the surviving capital a reason to keep looking eastward, to keep the frontier in mind, to keep the question of the East unsettled rather than closed. The empire did not rise again. It is important to be honest about that. It collected no lost provinces, restored no vanished glory, reversed no long decline. It survived, diminished and dependent, into an age of gunpowder it had barely learned to fight in. But its survival quietly reshaped how Europe imagined the line between worlds. A single man did not fall at the Kerkoporta. A single wall held. And from that morning, the map of the possible was redrawn, not by a great victory, but by the simple, stubborn fact that the city was still there.